Okay, this video is about factoring by grouping. Remember that factoring is taking a polynomial and breaking it down into multiple smaller polynomials that are multiplied together. So we're going to look at a polynomial that has 4 terms in it and look at how we can factor this polynomial. So say I have 12x cubed plus 16x squared plus 3x plus 4. So the first thing we want to check whenever we're factoring is see if all of these terms have a greatest common factor in them. And looking at it, it doesn't look like they do. Not every term has an x value in it. For example, the 3 is prime, but not all of the numbers are divisible by 3. So we don't have a greatest common factor of the whole polynomial. So what I'm going to do is first I'm going to change my pen color. Then I'm going to group these polynomials, this big polynomial, into 2 smaller polynomials. And then I'm just going to deal with each of these smaller polynomials by themselves. So looking at this first set of parentheses, if I wanted to factor that, I would factor out the greatest common factor. And the greatest common factor here is a 4x squared. So I have 4x squared times 3x plus 4. Okay. Now, I'm going to factor out the other polynomial. I'm just going to add them together. Since I know that this thing I just barely wrote is equivalent to this set of parentheses, I just need to find what this other red part of my polynomial is equivalent to, and then I add them together. So this second set of parentheses actually doesn't have a greatest common factor. We would just say the greatest common factor is 1. So I'm just going to put a 1 outside here and leave the inside the same. And then let me just so we know what's going on, make sure it's clear that those two things are equal. So now I've got what actually looks like a more complicated polynomial. I don't have, my polynomial now isn't in factored form, it's not in standard form, it's just in this kind of gross form. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to look at, let me change my pen color again, let's get out some green. I'm now going to look at this as a term, the 4x squared times 3x plus 4, and then this as a term, 1 times 3x plus 4. And what I'm going to try to do is I'm going to factor the greatest common factor out of these two terms. So what I mean by that is that both of these terms have a 3x plus 4 in them. So I'm going to think about factoring a 3x plus 4 out of both of the terms that are underlined in green. Now, if I factor out a 3x plus 4 from the first term, all I'm left with is a 4x squared. If I factor out a 3x plus 4 out of the second green term, this one, all I'm left with is a 1. Okay, so now what it's looking like is I have 2 polynomials that are multiplied together. I'm going to write this one without brackets so that we don't get confused. Now this right here looks a lot like factored form. In fact, this is factored form. This polynomial is now factored. Okay. Now factoring by grouping is fairly simple. Basically, it's just a series of factoring out the greatest common factors. So let me get my highlighter out. So right here, well, let's actually do it. Let's number these steps. So my first step, I just factored out the greatest common factor from the first half of my polynomial and the second half of my polynomial. And then on my second step, all I did was factor out a greatest common factor again. It's just that the greatest common factor was a polynomial, 3x plus 4. Okay, and that's how we do factoring by grouping. Let's go ahead and do a couple more examples. Okay, so the next example I want to do is 3x cubed plus 3x squared plus 3x plus 3. Okay, when I see something like this, the first thing I'm going to look at is see if all the terms have a greatest common factor in them. And in this case, they do. Every term is divisible by 3. So I'm going to start just by factoring a 3 out of here. See, isn't that so much nicer without 3? It's just a bunch of x's and then a 1. Now I'm going to factor the inside, the set of parentheses now by grouping. So I'm just going to leave the 3 out front, and I'm going to bring the brackets in just so I don't get confused with tons of sets of parentheses. And first, I'm going to group my polynomial into 2 groups instead of 1. Okay, now I have my 2 groups. Now I'm going to go ahead and factor the greatest common factor out of both of my groups. So the first one, I can factor an x squared out, leaving me with x plus 1 inside. The second one can't be factored anymore. I'm just going to bring a 1 outside because the greatest common factor of x and 1 is 1. Okay. Now I'm going to factor out the greatest common factor of this term and this term. So if I factor an x plus 1 out of both of the terms underlined in green, then I have an x squared and a 1 left over. So then this lovely thing would be the factored form of the polynomial I started with. Okay, we're going to do one more example. If you notice, both of the examples we just did, the greatest common factor of the second pair, so this term and this term, the greatest common factor there was 1. I want to show you guys an example where the greatest common factor of the second group is not 1. So we're going to do this example. X cubed minus 2x squared plus 5x minus 10. So step 1, I want to search my polynomial and see if there's a greatest common factor that is greater than 1. And in this case, there's not a greatest common factor that I can factor out of all 4 of these terms. So I'm going to group my polynomial into 2 smaller polynomials that are added together. Okay. Now this first set of parentheses, I need to factor out the greatest common factor, which is x squared. So x squared, bring that out, and I'm left with x minus 2 inside. And then with the second set of parentheses, I need to find the greatest common factor. And here the greatest common factor is 5. If I factor that out, I'm left with an x minus 2. Now I have these 2 terms, and I'm going to factor out the greatest common factor again, which is now x minus 2. And then what's left after I factor out the x minus 2 is x squared, and then plus 5. So it's the same idea. I just wanted to show you guys an example where I actually have a number out front right here.